Horologist's silent revenge. The workshop of Elias Thorne did not permit the intrusion of the human voice. It was a cathedral of friction and frequency, populated by 300 clocks that exhaled in a polyphonic rhythm. To Elias, speech was a clumsy tool, vague, imprecise, and prone to emotional debris. Gears, however, never lied. Elias sat at his workbench, a jeweler's loupe pressed into his eye socket like a glass parasite. Before him lay a 19th-century gold repeater, its internal organs spilled across a velvet mat. He moved with the surgical grace of a man who measured his life in vibrations per hour. The bell above the shop door remained silent. Elias had removed the clapper years ago, but the vibration through the floorboards told him the guest had arrived. Arthur Sterling did not fit in the basement shop. He was a man of broad shoulders and expensive wool, smelling of cedarwood and unearned confidence. He stepped over the threshold, his heavy boots disrupting the delicate dust motes that danced in the light of Elias' desk lamp. Sterling didn't offer a greeting. He didn't need to. He crossed the room and placed a heavy, mahogany box on the workbench. His movements were jagged, lacking the circular fluidity Elias respected. Sterling tapped the top of the box with a ringed finger, an impatient, rhythmic demand. Elias did not look up immediately. He finished seating a microscopic screw, then slowly retracted his loop. He looked at the box, then at Sterling. The man's face was a map of greed. He had swindled Elias' father out of the shop's deed 30 years ago, leaving the old man to die in a state-funded ward while Sterling built an empire on discovered antiquities. Now, Sterling gestured toward the box and then to his wrist. He wanted the centerpiece of his collection, the solstice chronograph, restored by the only hands capable of touching it. Elias opened the box. The solstice chronograph was a masterpiece of celestial mechanics, capable of tracking lunar phases, tides, and the exact position of the stars over London. But it was broken. A mainspring had snapped, or so it seemed. Sterling leaned over the bench, his shadow swallowing Elias' workspace. He pointed to the glass casing, then made a winding motion with his hand. His eyes were wide, manic. The watch was worth a fortune, but only if it ticked. Elias nodded once. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a specialized set of calipers. He began to disassemble the watch, his movements so methodical they appeared hypnotic. Sterling watched, transfixed by the shimmering brass and silver. As Elias worked, he shifted a heavy, cast-iron weight at the base of a nearby floor clock, a massive, 6-foot Gothic monster known as the Executioner. He had been repairing its pendulum for 3 weeks. In reality, he had been recalibrating the release catch of the overhead lead weights. Elias paused. He held up a tiny, jagged piece of steel, the broken part for Sterling to see. Sterling leaned in closer, his nose nearly touching the velvet mat. He was looking for the flaw, his brow furrowed in concentration. Elias reached for a bottle of oil, but his hand slipped. A heavy brass tray clattered to the floor. The sound was a physical blow in the silent room. Sterling flinched, his head jerking up, but then he saw Elias pointing toward the floor clock. Elias gestured that the vibration had shifted the alignment of the great pendulum. Sterling, annoyed, stepped toward the Executioner. He peered into the dark wooden cabinet of the clock, looking for the source of the noise Elias was miming. He had to stoop, his head and neck perfectly framed by the heavy oak casing. Elias didn't use a weapon. He simply reached out and touched a small, inconspicuous lever hidden behind his workbench. The silence of the room was punctured by a sharp, metallic clack. The 12-pound lead weight, held aloft by a frayed silk cord Elias had spent days weakening, did not slide, it fell. It was a vertical guillotine, gravity doing the work that words never could. There was no scream. There was only the muffled thud of lead meeting bone, followed by the rhythmic, indifferent ticking of 300 clocks. Elias stood still for a full minute, counting his own pulse. It was steady, 72 beats per minute. He walked over to the clock. He didn't look at Sterling's face. Precision did not require sentiment. He reached into the cabinet and retrieved the lead weight. With practiced ease, he reset the cord, replacing the frayed silk with a sturdy steel wire. He wiped the weight clean with a microfiber cloth and placed it back on its hook. He then returned to the Solstice chronograph. He picked up a small, identical spring from a hidden compartment in his bench, one that wasn't broken. He slotted it into place. Elias wound the watch. The tiny, silver heartbeat filled the gap where a man's breathing used to be. Elias placed the watch back in its mahogany box and closed the lid. He then sat back down, replaced his loop, and began working on a simple cuckoo clock, waiting for the evening light to fade. The police would find the accident tomorrow. They would see a heavy weight that had fallen due to an old cord. They would see a silent, grieving horologist who couldn't have shouted a warning even if he had wanted to. In the shop of Elias Thorne, everything was finally in sync. 2 hours after the sun dipped below the city's skyline, the shop was flooded with a different kind of light, the erratic, strobing blue and red of emergency vehicles. Detective Miller entered the basement with his shoulders hunched, instinctively ducking his head. He was a man of heavy size and jingling pocket change, a walking cacophony that Elias Thorne immediately found loathsome. Behind him followed a forensic technician, a woman who moved with the clinical, silent precision of a shadow. Elias remained at his bench. He did not turn. He did not stand. He simply kept his loop fixed on the guts of a pocket watch, his hands as steady as the stone foundation of the building. Miller walked a slow circuit of the room. He stopped at the executioner. He looked at the mahogany box on the floor, the one Sterling had brought, and then at the body which had been moved onto a gurney by the paramedics minutes prior. The detective stepped into Elias' line of sight. He tapped a notebook with a pen, then pointed at the floor clock's open cabinet. He raised his eyebrows in a silent question. What happened? Elias slowly removed his loop. He didn't reach for a notepad. Instead, he reached into a drawer and pulled out a length of frayed silk cord, the decoy he had prepared earlier. He held it up to the light, letting the detective see the snapped, fuzzy ends of the fiber. Elias then pointed to the heavy lead weight resting inside the clock. He made a downward motion with his hand, ending in a flat palm against the workbench. Gravity, decay, an accident. Miller chewed on the inside of his cheek. He walked over to the clock and peered at the mounting hook. He took a flashlight from his belt, the beam cutting through the dimness like a scalpel. He inspected the wood, the metal, and the wire Elias had replaced just an hour ago. Everything was pristine. Everything was perfectly, logically broken. The forensic technician knelt by the clock. She wasn't looking at the weight. She was looking at the dust. Elias felt a microscopic prickle of heat on the back of his neck. He watched her through the reflection in a glass-domed anniversary clock on his desk. She traced the outline of where the body had fallen. Then she stood and walked to Elias' workbench. She didn't speak, she simply held out her hand. Elias looked at her. Her eyes were sharp, analytical. He slowly opened his palm. She didn't look for blood. There had been no spray, only a crushing blow. She was looking for vibrations. She placed her fingers on his wrist, checking his pulse. Elias stared back. He didn't blink. He allowed his heart to maintain its mechanical 72-beat rhythm. He was a component of the room, no more prone to panic than a brass gear. After a long 10 seconds, she released him. She turned to Miller and gave a single, curt nod. Steady. No physiological signs of distress. Miller wasn't satisfied, but he was out of evidence. He looked around the room, at the 300 ticking witnesses that refused to testify. He looked at the Solstice chronograph sitting in its mahogany box. The detective reached out to open the box. Elias' hand moved faster, placing a protective, flat palm on the lid. Miller froze. He looked at Elias. Elias didn't flinch. He slowly slid a printed receipt across the desk, a predated work order for a total overhaul of the chronograph, dated 2 weeks prior. It established why the watch was there, why Sterling had visited, and why Elias was working on it. The detective stared at the receipt. He looked at the silent, stone-faced man behind the bench. With a frustrated grunt, Miller clicked his pen shut. He gestured for the technician to gather her kits. They moved toward the door, their heavy footsteps receding up the stairs, leaving the basement to return to its natural state. The door clicked shut. The vibration of the police cruiser's engine faded into the distance. Elias Thorne did not celebrate. He did not sigh with relief. He stood up, walked to the door, and turned the deadbolt. He returned to his bench and picked up the Solstice chronograph. He opened the lid. The silver heartbeat was still steady, still perfect. He took a small polishing cloth and wiped away the single, invisible smudge Miller's thumb had left on the gold casing. He then reached up and adjusted the hands of the great Gothic clock. It was precisely 10:42 p.m. Elias sat back down, picked up his loupe, and disappeared back into the silence. The debt was paid. The gears were aligned. And in the basement of Elias Thorne, time moved on, indifferent to the absence of the dead. The air of the hourglass. The morning air was crisp, unburdened by the humidity of the basement. Elias Thorne stood on a sidewalk he hadn't tread upon in nearly a decade. In his gloved hand, he carried the mahogany box, wrapped now in plain, brown butcher paper. He walked with a rhythmic tap-slide, the gait of a man who moved to a metronome. He did not look at the faces of the commuters or the flashing digital tickers of the city's banks. To Elias, digital time was a lie, a frantic approximation of the truth. He stopped before a modest, red-brick row house. It was a sharp contrast to the glass and steel monolith Sterling had called home. The silent handover. Elias didn't knock. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small brass key, one he had kept in a velvet-lined drawer for 30 years. He placed it in the lock. It turned with a familiar mechanical ***. Inside, the house smelled of old paper and lavender. A woman sat by the window in a wheelchair, her back to the door. She was watching the birds in the garden, her hands resting limply on a patchwork quilt. Clara Thorne did not turn around. She had lived in silence since the stroke that followed her husband's death. The death Sterling had accelerated with his lawsuits and his greed. Elias walked into her line of sight. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply placed the mahogany box on her lap. Her eyes, clouded by age but sharp with recognition, tracked his movements. She looked at the box, then at her brother. Elias reached down and untied the twine. He peeled back the paper, revealing the polished wood. With a slow, deliberate motion, he flipped the latch and opened the lid. The solstice chronograph sat nestled in its silk bed. The morning sun hit the gold casing, sending a prism of light dancing across the ceiling. Elias reached in and gave the crown a final, delicate turn. The room was suddenly filled with a sound Clara hadn't heard in 3 decades. The high-pitched, crystalline tink-tink-tink asterisk of the repeater mechanism. It wasn't just a watch. It was the masterpiece their father had been building when Sterling stole the shop. It was the heart of their family, returned. Clara's fingers, gnarled and trembling, reached out. She touched the cold gold. A single tear tracked a path through the wrinkles on her cheek, but her expression remained as serene as a marble statue. Elias stood over her for a moment. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a rare, brief moment of human friction. He looked at the watch. The moon phase indicator was perfectly aligned. The tide was coming in. The stars were exactly where they were meant to be. He turned and walked toward the door. As he stepped back onto the street, he pulled a small, silver pocket watch from his vest. He checked the time, then looked at the sun. The world was loud, messy, and chaotic. But behind the brick walls and the locked doors, the gears were turning exactly as he had designed them. Elias Thorne closed the door to the house, and for the first time in 30 years, he didn't feel the need to check his pulse.